Hi, welcome everybody. I'm delighted to be with you virtually. This is a recorded session. I'm online monitoring the chat. I'll try to answer questions as we go, and I've included a few pause points where the recording can be stopped if we need to catch up on questions. So, let's get started. When I talk about code, what makes some code better than others, I always include the advice: give things good names. And then I quickly move on to the next slide. And I don't really do any specifics about what makes a name good, because I know that that's at least an entire talk. And this is one of the possible many talks on giving things good names. Naming is subjective and it's demanding. This is not a series of kind of turn the handle rules where out pop good names when you just apply these mechanisms, but I'm going to show you things to value, things to care about when you're naming. The first thing you need to care about is naming itself. It matters. It's important. This is how we explain the code to the other people who read the code or to ourselves later, but it's also what leaks into all the conversations we have about everything. So when you're explaining something to a customer and you say, well, I'll clear the exported flag, that's because you have something called exported flag, or at least a flag that's called exported or something. It comes into all our conversations, and oh my gosh, are C++ people bad at it or what? I mean, we're famous for it, right? We have RAII, which, as everyone knows, stands for Scope Bound Resource Management. WestConst, which maybe should be called Const West. And most importantly, we have all these examples out there of an object called lowercase x, which is an instance of a class called uppercase x. Right? You can find terrible naming in courses and books and talks and live production code, which is probably the worst part. But you can get better at it. It's not a talent that you're born with. It's more like playing the violin. You can learn to be better at it. And that's what I'm trying to start with this talk. Now let's be clear. I could not care less about what letters are capital and what letters are lowercase, or whether or not your great-grandfather was killed by an underscore and therefore you never use them in your variable names. That, to me, that's all just bike shed. Just pick a convention and stick to it, right? This isn't about whether a class is called employee with a capital E or employee with a lowercase e. It's about whether it's called employee or associate or person or struct 17. Because names carry meaning. And they're not always the meaning that you intend. Sometimes things that look like they're all kind of the same. We have these thingies that aren't valid forever, and we need to keep track of a date related to that loss of validity. But then people say like, I don't think you can use a thing on its inactive date, but you can use it on its expiry date. And it's just like connotations, just cultural associations with what you think are all synonyms. And sometimes people call things date, but they actually store dates and times in them, so it actually expires at like 10 o'clock on the 17th. So you can use it at 9 o'clock on the 17th, but you can't use it at 11 o'clock on the 17th. And customers who think you can use it all day on the 17th have a real problem with this, but also customers who think you shouldn't be able to use it at all on the 17th have a real problem with this. So just what you call something triggers off a whole lot of thoughts in people's minds, and you have to do it correctly. Great example from the standard library. There's a function called empty. Right? Is that a verb that empties a collection? Or is it sort of an adjective and you're querying whether it's empty or not? And it's a clue that there is a function called clear. Oh, okay. And maybe you changed your vote after you learn that. And naming matters everywhere. Obviously, if I'm writing like a public API, I'm building some real system, it's going to be maintained by a large team, then I have to communicate with the other members of my team. I have to communicate with the strangers who are calling my API. But, say I'm just tossing together a quick example, a little slide where I want to show somebody, I don't know, how const works or the value of no discard or something. Then I can just use like single letter variables, right? ABC, we all do that. Well, here's a tweet. This is from Nicole. She says, it's really hard at times for me to follow examples where they use one-letter variables. I'm reading this tweet and I'm ready to retweet it immediately. You are so right, Nicole. It is hard to follow. When you already don't understand a concept, but things are just called I, J, and K or A, B, and C, it's hard. She says, if you're trying to teach coding, maybe try to make it a bit more descriptive or creative than ABC. Oh, preach it, sister. I am with you. This is correct. But then Nicole breaks my heart. In an instant, in a heartbeat, I go from, yes, you're so right, to, oh no, what have we done? Because she goes on to say, newbies can shorten them once they feel comfortable. Oh boy, like that is just so sad, right? Nicole has internalized that the smart people and the good people use the little variable names, the ABC, the X, Y, Z. And newbies as a crutch, they need stuff to be called total and interest rate and description, right? But when they get good, they can do ABC again. Oh man, no. We should all be doing good names all the time. And if you're teaching people, teach them what you want to see. Good names tell a story. Sadly, so do bad names. Now, when the name is like D1, the story is I can't be bothered to explain myself to you. But that's not the only story that's available to tell. Certainly, when you give things good names, you don't need to put comments in. You know this trick. Right? If you call a function called sort, you don't need a comment before your loop that says you're sorting. If you call a function called count, you don't need a comment that explains your counting. And if you have a variable called total, you don't need, as I have seen in live production code, int I, semicolon, 2 slashes, total. I've seen it, it's true. But if you name something badly, you can confuse people or even actively mislead people. And this generally is something that happens when code changes and names don't. I'm not giving a value judgment on how something got a bad name. The name might have been good for it at the time. It's just not good for it now. So consider a function called setStatus. It takes some application status, I guess that's an enum, and it's setting, I'm guessing, a member variable to whatever it was passed in. Cool. This is, I guess, an inline function in a class definition. All right. I mean, you wouldn't need to see the code in line. As soon as you see setStatus, you know what it does. If there's a member variable called status, it totally sets it to whatever was passed into setStatus, right? But time goes by, and for some reason we keep track of when the whatever this is that has an application status, probably an application, was last updated. Or maybe as part of some dashboard so people can see that there's been a change in the status of their application. And you go to all the functions that set anything and you add this line and life is good. More time goes by, more stuff happens, and you end up in this land, right? Now, if setStatus is being passed and approved, we do a bunch of special things. Maybe we're sending emails, maybe we're triggering paper letters to be mailed to people, who knows? A bunch of stuff that happens when your application is approved, and there's a bunch of stuff that happens when your application is denied. And I find this stuff in legacy code where everybody's convinced that the rogue emails that the customers are complaining about couldn't possibly be coming from a function like setStatus, because setStatus, you can tell on the face of it, all it does is set the member variable status and move on, right? And this is sometimes harder to spot than this, but this is relatively common pattern. The name has actively misled you. You think it's still status equals S, but it's got all this business logic and action going on in it, and it's causing confusion. And the solution is to replace it with two functions, approve and deny. Now this has lots of benefits. One of them is that the sentence the person says in the calling code goes from, and now I need to set the application status to approved, to, and now I need to approve the application, which is more active and is shorter, right? Approve is one word. Set status to approved is a lot more words than one. So now approve and deny are better named. Anyone reading the header file gets an idea of what can happen with an application. There's a tiny bit of duplication in that last updated equals now is in both functions, but other than that, it's pretty good. It's better names that tell a better story in the calling code and when you're reading through the functions. Now look, this is hard. And one of the reasons that it's hard is that code changes over time and teams change over time. That's okay. Just work with that. Things may not get their correct name right away. Or they may start with a correct name, which then drifts. The name doesn't change, but everything else changes, so the name's no longer correct, and then it gets a better name. If you're refactoring and you need to make a function, you need to grab these 100 lines and give them a name because they're clearly a function, there is a technique where you just mash your hand on the keyboard, and that's the name of the function. And then you can read it and figure out what its name should be after you've refactored into that function. The other way is to give it like these really, really long verbose names, except that even this is not a good example because it would probably say, instead of shipping costs, dollar amount 3, because dollar amount 3 or D3 or whatever you're working with, it doesn't have a proper name yet. You don't really know what it represents, but this function sets it. And then there's another thing which you haven't yet learned is called total. So you're calling it, accumulated amount 4, because you can see that people plus equal into it a lot, but you don't know what it really represents. And so eventually, as you start to learn what dollar amount 3 is, the name becomes, let's say, set shipping costs, adjust total, mark as shipped. And then you're like, oh, it's ship. This is everything we do when we ship the order. And then it gets its real name. It may take a while before things get their true names. Now, that doesn't mean it's an optional step or you can do it if there's time, but there probably won't be time. What I'm trying to tell you is don't be paralyzed. Don't be unable to go forward because you don't know a good name for something. As long as you're committed to having a good name eventually, you can come back. And I'm going to come back to this very point myself a little later. Don't feel pressure to get the name perfect the first time. Treat names as fluid because they are. But let me tell you the hardest part about naming well. It asks us to draw on empathy. And a lot of programmers are never taught to be empathetic. In fact, a lot of programmers are taught to actively avoid being empathetic. They say things like, my priority is the mission, not your feelings. Which has nothing to do with anything if you just the mission's not well supported by having crummy names for all the functions because if you're not caring about other people who are going to call the functions, right? If you're refactoring 100 lines out of 10,000 lines and it's only ever going to be called once, you're refactoring it just to give it a name and to get some understanding, then naming that's pretty easy because you know what it does and you call it that. You know who's calling it. You've got the context. So you call it update or ship or release or whatever and you're done. Right? When you're writing an API that other people are going to call these functions, it's a little harder sometimes to come up with names that work for them as well as for you. Maybe they use different words for things because they're not on your team. So is someone who takes an exam a student, a candidate, a learner, an exam taker? You may not have the same words. And the further you get from the people who are going to consume your name, the harder it is to come up with a good name. Which brings me to a little story about algorithm. I've actually told this story a bunch of times about how great algorithm is. We got sort. It's fantastic. You probably learned how to write sort if you took computer science, but you don't ever need to write your own sorts. So you have a collection, and on the slide, I'm going to have a bunch of integers, but on real life, you would have a lot more than 6, like maybe 1,000 or 10,000. They would be some kind of business objects. Like say you were running promotions and you had for each one how much it cost you, start dates, end dates, blah, 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 and how many extra sales or how much extra revenue you can associate with the promotion. So I can just call sort, and the default implementation for integers puts the smallest integers at the front. Boom, one call. If my 10,000 promotions thing, I might sort them all by how much revenue they brought in or by the ratio of the revenue to the cost or whatever else. It's pretty easy to pass a predicate into sort. That's fantastic. So I'm the manager of promotions and I want to know about the, say, 10 best promotions and look at them. Maybe give bonuses to the people who ran them or whatever. I've got some reason for wanting to have code that every month will tell me, what the 10 best promotions were. In the context of my integers on the screen, I might want the 3 smallest integers. So with 10,000 promotions, and especially since this is an object and copying things around can be expensive, I don't care what was 99th and what was 100th and what was 999th and what was 1,000th and so on. I just want to know about the 10 best. And algorithm is I got your back. You don't have to pay to sort the whole collection. We have partial sort. Partial sort moves the first ones up to the front, and they're in order, and leaves everything else in an unspecified order. Not the original order, but definitely not sorted. So in the case of the integers, the 3 smallest integers are up at the front, and the rest of the integers are at the end. In the case of the promotions, the 10 best, as defined by my predicate, promotions are at the front, and the other 99, 100, and whatever are hanging out at the end in whatever order they want. Okay, I say, that's great. I'm glad you thought of that. Partial sort, really smart. The thing is, I had that collection in order. Now, the integers aren't in order, but I had my promotions in start date order or something. And you've permuted my collection by bringing the best ones to the front, and also there's been some permutation in the back half, although we don't know what it is. So I kind of don't want to do a partial sort, sorry. Oh, sure. No problem. Check out partial sort copy. It makes a copy, a different collection that contains copies of the elements that would have been moved to the front, and it leaves your original collection unpermuted. That's perfect. That's exactly what you need, right? Now you can get your 10 best performing promotions in a little collection with just 10 items, and your original collection of 10,000 items is unpermuted, and you can continue to use it. There's nothing wrong with this story. It's brilliant. Except that, not the first time I told it, but one of the second or third times I told it, I suddenly had this moment of realizing nobody who wants this functionality is going to go to CPP reference and search for sort. Because they don't want to sort their 10,000 collections. One of their first requirements is that my original collection will remain unpermuted. So why would I ever look under sort? What they really want is something called maybe top n. Now, a couple people have pointed out that top n doesn't imply that it's sorted, and maybe I should call this top n underscore sorted. No, they're not wrong, but that's not really my point. In fact, if you want a top n that's not sorted, there's a non-existent nth element copy, which does what nth element does, but in a copy. It would be a good candidate for being called top n, and you could rename partial sort copy top n sorted. We're quibbling. The point is, partial sort copy is an implementer's name. It's a name that says what it does and how it does it, and maybe even why it does it. But it doesn't tell you what service it offers you. It doesn't tell you what you use it for. And it's not very findable for people who know that whatever else they want to do to their collection of 10,000 promotions, they sure don't want to sort it. Just a spot we can pause if we have to. So I've told you the problem, right? Naming matters. It's hard. You have to understand the real meaning and purpose of the thing you're naming. And you have to have empathy with the person who's going to consume your name and think the way they think in order to have the name convey that meaning over to them. So I'm going to give you some guidelines to follow to get better names. And the first one is be consistent. The first thing I want you to be consistent with is with what the users already say. This is especially true if you're writing business software, but it can also be true if you're writing games. If everybody already calls something gold, why are you calling it silver if there is no gold to contrast it with? If everybody already calls it energy, why are you calling it food? You know? Certainly in the business, people have words for things, and your words diffuse into their world. So maybe your code prints out a report of all the whatevers and their expiry dates. And it says expiry date on the report, but the users all say inactive date. Maybe your email sends people, maybe your system sends people email when something's going to expire or go inactive, and it says in the subject line and in the body that it's going to expire or it's going to go inactive or whatever. On your dialogues, you have words telling people to enter the inactive date, let's say. And then people will talk about the system. Users will talk amongst themselves. Users will talk to whoever it is they support with the software, and users will talk to you. And in all of these places, it's really vital to be consistent. It's also best if the people who use the software are the ones who choose these words. Just because you're typing code into the computer doesn't mean you get to say its expiry date if they call it inactive date, and vice versa. Once things have names, they should be called by the correct name everywhere. So your variable, the report heading, the email, and the conversations that you have with people. And the reason for this is that software outlasts people. So new users are going to call things by the name they see on the screen, by the name they see in their emails. And new developers are going to look for things in the code using the words that they heard from someone who saw something on a screen or read something in an email. So if they're told that the expiry date is wrong for things that are sold on public holidays, they're going to go looking for expiry date. And if it's inactive date in the software, they're going to have a really tough time finding things. You don't want like a translation layer. You want the same names for things in all these contexts. If you can, it's also really nice when you have a bunch of synonyms available to you to use different words for different things. And this is a completely arbitrary choice. You're like, your certification expires, but your coupon becomes invalid. And if you can get people to think that way, and if all the documentation is written that way, then when somebody is talking ambiguously, the fact that they said expires, you know they're talking about a certification. It's actually a very nice trick. But that means really working hard on your conversations. Like, don't let people say coupon if it's called a voucher. Don't let them say discount if it's called a coupon. Make everybody stay consistent with the naming that you're using in your system. And as I said, if you're writing software for a business, they should invent the names for things. The problem is that you may have a big long function like approve, and it may do like 8 things, and you want to give names to the 8 things, and they don't really have names for those 8 things. Okay. You can make names up if you have to, but please make up good names. And an example of a bad name is a dependent name that you invented. So we're not talking about a company that says, oh, we have our pre-approval step and then we do the approval. We're more talking about something like this. I'm refactoring out some really long function, and I figured out that the middle part loads stuff. So I've made a function called load, and then I have the part before that and the part after that. And they have these terrible names, preload and postload. Now, if those are temporary names and you're going to fix them later, that's fine. But like, these are not final names. And the reason they're not final names is I can read. I already know that this is the stuff right before load and the stuff right after load. Right? You've added no information. You might as well call them F. It's a function. You got to go in there and read them and say, what do we do before we load? Do we like figure out the file name? Okay, then call it determine file name. You know, what do we do afterwards? Figure out what it is and call it that. That way you're adding information in the name. Similarly, try not to leak your implementation out. A, because you might change it, and B, because no one cares. Right? Update config file. That's partial sort copy. That's you saying how you do it. Maybe later it's going to be in the cloud somewhere. Once upon a time, maybe it used to be in the registry. You're saving the configuration if there's multiple things that you save, or else you're just saving. Storage coordinates, because you've got like a warehouse and you've got warehouse number, aisle number, shelf number, blah, blah. Why are you leaking that in its name? It's the location. Try to use these simpler words rather than these here's how I implemented it words. In English, words come in pairs that go together, and when you mix them up, you throw people off from it. There's a little bit of cognitive dissonance, maybe to the extent that they can't find the other half of the pair. So for example, begin goes with end. Now this might be member functions like the functions that return iterators, but it could also be a pair of member variables or a pair of local variables in some function. Begin goes with end, not with last. Last, of course, goes with first. Create goes with destroy, not with cleanup. Open goes with close, not release. Next goes with previous, not rewind or back. And put goes with get, not retrieve. And perhaps controversially, I think source goes with destination, not with target. You mostly know. You just need to think for a minute. Does this go with that or with the other thing? If you're not sure, for a variety of reasons, including that English is maybe your second, third, fourth, fifth language, you can ask people. It's a wonderful Twitter poll. Which of these are better pairs? And you can put up 3 or 4 candidates of the pairings you'd like to consider. Also, metaphors generally make bad variable names because not everyone has your background. So if you're old enough, you know that there used to be cowboy movies in which the good cowboys wore white hats and the bad cowboys wore black hats. And if you're not old, but you're just a certain kind of geek, then you know that because someone told you that. And so then you know what white hat and black hat mean. But someone with a different background just doesn't happen to know that fact. It would be like calling someone a red shirt, right? Star Trek references, they don't work for everyone. And encoding a cultural reference into a name, is that going to create a long-lived explanation that people will make sense of this code later? Plus, they're super overloaded, like red and green. Is that stop and go? Start and stop? Pass and fail? Probably it's port and starboard, right? White and black, even if you set aside the problematic issue of using white for good and black for bad, and never using black for anything good and using dark instead, like dark mode, even if that's not your intention, it'll remind people when they see it. But more importantly, it's just too overloaded. Like, people don't necessarily get your meaning because it's a metaphor. You know, same as if you called things pink and blue so as to avoid the problematic male-female. You didn't make it less problematic by switching to pink and blue. Filter. This is not about offending people. This is about understanding. If I say filter and I pass in some predicate that clearly evaluates to the elements are odd, am I filtering out all the odd numbers? Or am I filtering so only the odd numbers remain? Oh, once someone's asked you, then you're suddenly not so sure, right? Whereas if they were called include if and exclude if, we would know, they would be clear. And that's my main problem with metaphors, is that if someone doesn't have the exact same cultural background as you, they may not get your metaphor. They may not understand the meaning. So use, a literal word that actually describes. This one is the replica. This one is the controller, rather than using a metaphor. Now let's talk about naming functions. Most good function names are built around a verb. It's something that's getting done. If it's a member function, it's something the object class does. If it's a free function, it's something your system does. Sometimes they're pretty generic. I'm not a big fan of update, but they do happen. But calculate tax, deduct fees, mark as read. This is stuff your system does. If you don't have a verb, then look for helpers. Is a good one. So is empty is less ambiguous than empty. Here's a tip. No discard is a wonderful thing, but if you need to put no discard on your function because people think it has a side effect and it doesn't, and they're supposed to be looking at the return value, then maybe your function doesn't have a very good name. Empty has to have no discard on it. Is empty probably doesn't. People know to look at the return. Other helpful helper verbs, has and can. So think about is shippable, that's an adjective, versus can ship, which is a verb. And it's a nice sentence. If blah.can ship, brace, blah.ship. Maybe some else about what you're going to do if it can't ship for whatever reason. Right? Whereas get ship status, I don't think that returns a bool, unlike is shippable and can ship. I think that returns me some sort of enum, and then I have to do different things depending on the enum, or if get ship status is equal to ready to ship or something like that. Think about the not. Do people mostly say if it's not ready to ship? And if they do say that, how do you want to pronounce that, or how do you want to spell that? By calling ready to ship and putting the not operator in front of it? Or do you want to have your function called not ready to ship? You see a lot of this. If not is invalid, would that be the same as if is valid? Should you offer both functions? Go too far with this and you end up, I love Visual Studio, but this is a terrible dialogue. It's like a million different options and they're all labeled disable whatever and they're all set to false. Which is sort of like enabling all of those being set to true. be careful about double negations. And then when you're naming functions, think about the order of the words, right? You have a noun, you have a verb, but are you going to, in general, say verb noun or noun verb? Certain things feel kind of natural to us. Like I would never say determine. I would never say tax determine, as you can tell. I would say determine tax. I would say charge fees, not fees charged, but I do say employee update. I do say inventory check. And it's worth asking yourself why and just thinking about it. You know, one consequence of putting a number of functions together that start with the same noun is they'll be together in alphabetical lists. And they all start with the same verb, they'll be together in alphabetical lists. Which way do you want it? So if your tool shows you all the functions in some pane on the side that you can double click on, you know, do you want all the updates together or do you want all the employee related things together? If you have a tidier, and these exist, that sort functions alphabetically, again, how do you want things clumped together? If you're typing and you're relying on autocomplete, how much do you want to have to type before you get to the part that's unique? Has entries, has risks. Should they be together because they both start HAS? And then later on we have get risks and get entries together and add entry and add risk together? Or would you like all the entry stuff together and all the risk stuff together? And is that important enough to name them differently? So functions take parameters. And these serve two purposes, and you have to meet both purposes while you're naming them. They are local variables in that function, so you should totally name them with that in mind, and I will be talking about local variables soon. I hate when parameters shadow member variables. I don't like all this points to x is equal to x business. But I also don't want you to decorate the parameter. If you must decorate something because you can't think of different names for the parameters and the member variables, then decorate the member variable. And that's because the parameters are cues to the function caller, which is why, even though they're not required in the header, you should provide them in the header, and then your IDE can do something like this. So I'm constructing an employee object called new hire, and I'm passing it a string and an integer, and I'm getting this tooltip from the IDE that gives me the variable names, full name and yearly salary, so I know what I'm passing into that function. There we go. We have some questions. Phil asks me about ubiquitous language, and that isn't a phrase I've heard before, and a quick little Google, yeah, that is covering the similar ground. Everybody use the same words for things, have a common language between the users and the developers, and I'm certainly saying I want to see that language extend into the variable names themselves, not just your conversations, into absolutely everything you do. So ubiquitous, good word for it. I'm supposed to be able to tick these, but I don't actually see a control for that. Oh, thank you, mysterious helper. Tina says, and Hendrik actually asks a similar thing, you know, when you tell someone, this is a crummy name, and they're like, oh, you're right, I'll add a comment, or that's okay, I remember what it is. This depends on your authority. Obviously, if you're the code reviewer, you can say, like, no, we have a gate here, you can't, you have to name. If you have equal rights to them and the team, I suppose you could just change their variable names after the conversation, go stomp on their heads. Probably wouldn't really enjoy that. The only used by me is actually the easiest one to refute, because if you're as old as I am and you have some gray hair, it may not have occurred to this person that time passes and you forget things, and it's only used by you now, but you're going to go do something else for a year and then come back to it, and you're doing yourself a favor. I find it really strange that people think like it's easier to give things crummy names. Like 10 seconds from now in the debugger, you're going to be trying to remember what DHG is. And if it had a better name, you'd have an easier time like the next time you debug. The idea that having gone int I / total, your life is now so much easier because you can just say I everywhere, compared to if you use the refactoring tool in your Visual Studio, or whatever tool you're using, and renamed it to total and we're done with it. It's like takes longer to argue that you shouldn't do it than it does to do it. And don't get me wrong, I know
People do the arguing. They'll argue for 20 minutes about something that would take 30 seconds. And to that extent, I think naming is a muscle and a habit. It's not easy, but if you get from the position of naming matters, we need to be better at it. We need to do it well. I'll do it even when it doesn't matter. And then hopefully that's the habit that sticks. Josh asks about naming variables and functions the same way as data types. Definitely, it's differently. That's why I have heuristics for classes, for functions, for local variables. The fact that it matters doesn't change, but the actual heuristics that you're going to follow beyond consistency, which applies to everything, we do have slightly different, like functions should have a verb, whereas variables tend to be nouns, that kind of thing. Tom asks about research. I'm not aware of published research connecting bug rates to names. It seems to me a natural conclusion. I certainly have a ton of anecdotes about hidden bugs that were not discovered because the names confused people and caused them to believe that something was happening, so they didn't bother stepping through in the debugger, or they didn't bother looking at a variable. And then later, when they decided that they'd ruled out all the impossible things, so whatever was left, no matter how improbable, must be right, as part of solving the bug, they realized that something had a bad name. And I've got, a lifetime's worth of anecdotes about that. I'd love to see research. And if someone finds some, you can email me or DM me on Twitter or the Include Discord, and I'd love to hear it. And with that, I think I'm caught up. So I'm going to slink back into the shadows.
Now let's talk about naming classes. Generally, I expect classes to be nouns. Technically, you can make a noun by taking a verb and sticking ER on the end. So you have a manager, an updater, a normalizer, a formatter. I don't like these. I'm suspicious. What do you manage? What do you update? What do you normalize? What do you format? Now, sometimes it's nothing. It's like, well, we have a printer and a plotter and a disk drive, and these objects don't print or plot. We're just, counting how much things cost or keeping track of their serial numbers or something. Then that's fine. That's not really an object's name, a class's name ending with ER. But yeah, sometimes they format a report. Okay, so at bare minimum, let's call it report formatter. But maybe we could call it report. Maybe that would work. What do they normalize? What do they update? What do they manage? Get the noun's name in there. Maybe even only use the noun. And try, again, nobody wants your implementation details, which can become obsolete. So when I see a class with class in its name, oh, I hate that. But also like proxy, factory, adapter, interface. Do you need those in there? Maybe, maybe not. Think about whether you really need them or not. Is inventory singleton a better name than inventory? And please, for the real name, for the forever name, don't just list the contents. While you're refactoring, you may do that. But calling something name and address, class name and address, and it has member variables, name and some for the address. And then later we rename it to name, address, and phone, and then name, address, phone, and email. That's not a class name. Like, why aren't you using a tuple? There's a reason why you're not just using a tuple, right? It's because you're making an abstraction. So give it a name like contact info. That's an abstraction. And it's an abstraction whose name doesn't have to change as you add and remove member variables because nobody has a fax anymore. Think about the purpose of the class in the larger system and what people use it for. Then call it that. Now, obviously your classes have members, member variables, and member functions. Repeating the class name is almost never right. An employee has an employee name. Really? Doesn't an employee just have a name? Yeah, they may have a department name or a manager name or something, but for themselves, do we really have to say employee name? And if there's a record, something that you print out when people leave, and you need to have a function to print that, I would not like to see that called print employee record. Unless people in the company go around saying, oh, Steve is leaving, we'll have to print an employee record. You know, and when it comes out of the printer, it says employee record across the top in big letters, then okay. But if people are not already calling something an employee record, then just print record. Don't repeat the class name and the function names or the member verbal names. And love adjectives, right? Name is ambiguous, full name less so. Salary is really ambiguous, but annual, monthly, weekly, or hourly salary is less ambiguous. It's clear what's going on here. And I almost never encode the type, right? People will say, what's the ship date on that? What was Joe's hire date again? So that's okay. You know, people don't say to each other, hey, what was that weight once we converted it to a string? You know, you may need to keep the weight as a string, as a member variable. That's fine, but don't call it weight string. What's it for? Is it for the report? Then call it, you know, wait for report or something. The reason I like hire date and ship date instead of hired and shipped is that they might make you think that they were flags. Has this person been hired yet? Has this order been shipped yet? Right? And so that's why putting a name in there that fits into how people would talk conversationally, like hire date and ship date, I think it's a better fit than something that could be ambiguous. Now, there's certain member function names that kind of are chosen for you, and you can choose whether to join that ongoing situation or not, but they're there. So constructors and destructors. If you have a constructor that opens a file and a destructor that closes a file, people understand when they're called, right? They know when they happen. They have an understanding. So maybe that's a better choice than you putting them in things called clean up or tidy up or whatever, especially if all you do is call tidy up or clean up from the destructor. Just put the work in the destructor. People know what get and set are. They're expecting get to do return member variable, or perhaps return tiny bit of math. You know, like I have get age and it subtracts your birth date from the current date and perhaps converts it to years, and that's your age. If your get is going to do something different, there's lots of verbs in this world. Try fetch, read, load, retrieve. There's lots available to you. And I generally expect get thingy to be const. And if your get thingy can't be const because it's like I got to go to the mainframe and populate myself with everything I need, then let's not call it get. Call it, you know, download. And then it's obvious that it changes all the member variables because we downloaded everything. Worked with lots of people over the decades who love this particular combination. So if you have some member variable temperature, the function temperature that takes an integer sets it, returns void, it has nothing to do. And the function temperature that doesn't take anything and returns an int is the get. A lot of people hate them. They're hard to grep for, but be aware that's a pattern. If you have a get set allergy, as it were, this is another way of doing get and set. So enums. I prefer scoped enums because everybody has an OK or none. And if you are using old school enums, you have to decorate NTOK, SBOK, FCOK, and so on. If you have scoped enums, you don't need to do that. So then you don't need to repeat the enum name or anything like that. But when we're talking about enums, think about how you design your class and whether or not you want to leak that enum out of the class. So remember when we had that application that had a set status and then later it gained like an approve and deny and was clearly using some enum called application status, right? If you just have a get status method, and people have to know about the enum so that they can say, well, if the status is equal to application status : approved, or you could write this, you know, the code for is approved is not a complicated code, right? You know what it does. But now whoever's calling this code doesn't need to know about that enum. They just ask the application, are you approved or not? And yeah, it's one line long. It tests status against the approved member of the enum. That's okay. Now you've encapsulated your enum inside your class. Nobody outside the class needs it. And this code is also shorter. We didn't need a line break. Okay, you're going to write some functions. There might be member functions, there might be free functions. I don't care. It's going to be local variables. Let's talk local variables. We'll start with the edge case, because everybody likes to tell me about that one time when they had a one-letter variable and nobody died. And I get it. I do, in general, rail against single-letter variables, but there are times when they are good. One time is in loops. If you have a like for I equals 0, I is less than 10, I plus plus kind of a loop, making that index so it's not one letter long, you're not helping, right? You haven't made anybody's life better. Go ahead and use IJK in loops if you should be writing a loop at all, and ask yourself, should I be writing a loop? If you're doing some sort of a scientific calculation and there's a formula, dear Lord, do not use horizontal position, vertical position, time, and velocity. Use the letters in the formula. And there's another case. Someone told me about this after a different talk, because they have to come up and tell me why single letter variables are okay. And I kind of like it. When you have a really tiny little scope, you can indicate that to people by the shortness of the variable name. So here it wouldn't be wrong for our string that comes back from getNextResponse to be called response. But if I call it R, and if no one ever touches it after this close brace, then it's kind of like a pronoun. It's kind of like calling me she after you've already said my name a couple times. Its very shortness indicates the smallness of its scope. It's not wrong to give it the longer name. In this case, it might not also be wrong to give it the short one. But most of the time, your variables should have long names. And I don't mean like D3, ooh, that's twice as long. No, real names. Nouns. Better still, a noun with an adjective. Right? The next whatever, the current whatever, the remaining whatevers, the active whatevers. Too many people basically put the type and nothing else in the name. So you have an employee called E, a vector of policies called policies, and a double called D. We have not learned anything from these variables. In fact, when I get into almost always auto arguments, most of the time people, when they are specifying the type, have terrible names, and then when they switch to almost always auto, they have better names. And it's like, that's actually the biggest improvement there. Focus on why you're making a variable and what you're keeping in it. So you want to build a collection of policies and keep them in a vector? That's nice. Why? What's it for? Why do some policies get to go in the vector? What are you going to do with the vector once it's full? That is the name of it. I mean, naming's hard, but when you're doing it right, suddenly it isn't. Because a more descriptive name, a more explaining name just fits. You can see that you're telling people how this works. Think about people who are trying to find this piece of code starting from nothing. What will they look for? If they're trying to find the code that moves all the customers of the salesperson onto someone else because the salesperson is leaving, they're going to look for customer, they're going to look for salesperson, but they're probably throughout your code. Maybe they're going to look for leaving, but that's probably not what you called it, right? That's too informal. Maybe it's called termination, or maybe it's called end of employment. Like, think about people who are searching. And if you're writing a system to manage your employees, the word employee is probably there a million times. So that's why when you put adjectives like next, remaining, current, active, you make it easier to search for. And this is especially true around plurals. Like if I'm looking for employees singular and I keep finding a bunch of employees plural, in vector of employees, oh man, that's not helping me. So more words, more things to search for. If you get up to like 5 words all jammed together, you're kind of in name, address, phone number, email, and fax territory. That's probably not a good idea, but maybe keep that name while you're learning what its true, more compact name is. Abbreviation, that's what it stands for. It stands for abbreviations, and they're generally bad because people don't know what they stand for. ID, I'll grant you, but with everything else, you know, the mapping from the word to its short form is really strong, so you feel happy, but back again, not so strong, and a lot of people just don't know what you're talking about. Some people just use the first syllable, ish, and again, that may be really obvious to you, but filling it out to the rest of them, not so much. And if you use the first letters, man, that's a right-only concept. What do these stand for? I found these in the wild. They stand for annual revenue, total income, and revenue delta. And yes, income and revenue represent exactly the same concept. They are interchangeable. Just one developer liked to call it revenue and one developer liked to call it income. Don't do this. I'll grant you one exception. If you Google the initials and what you get back is the thing you're talking about, so like GPS, IBM, excellent. Go ahead and use the initials. It's just like using X and Y or T and V in the scientific formula. But if you don't, spell it out because vowels are free. Are there special rules when you're writing templates? Mostly no. If you're writing a templated function, that's a function. Use all the guidelines I told you for functions. When you're writing a templated class, that's a class. Use the guidelines I told you for classes. But there's the matter of the type name. Do you first of all say template class T or template type name T? From C++ 17 onwards, there is no circumstance under which the compiler cares. Before that, it was only for templates. I know people who say, I'll use type name if it'll work with fundamental types, otherwise I'll use class. Okay, I mean, you're not wrong. I tend to use class because it's less letters for me to press on the keyboard. But then what do you call the thing? T is fine if there's just one. We all know what that is. If you're a template that works with any type T, we're good. But the minute there's more than one, you need to give them names. Here's Microsoft's implementation of basic string and a vector. And you can see they start with underscores because underscore followed by a capital letter is reserved for implementers. And that means that you can be sure you're not landing on anyone else's names. But it's not a single letter. It's not E, T, and A. It's LM, traits, and alloc. Think about how to help people who are going to have to pass multiple classes into your template and how they will know which is which. Been a while. Good time to pause in case we need to catch up in the chat room.
Hello. Patsy's asking about people who get mad when you want them to, change whitelist and blacklist to allow and deny. I've had this pushback, and as long as I just kept talking about the fact that it upset people, I would get pushback like, well, I don't care, which probably relates to my other comment about empathy. I no longer get any pushback when I point out that you're using a metaphor. Like red and green don't have special social meaning, but it's really bad to have your functions called red and green when you really should be calling them pass and fail or stop and go or approve and deny, because not everybody is going to understand what you meant by those metaphorical colors. And if you take that position for white and black, then sometimes a light bulb goes off and people are like, oh yeah, it would be clearer. Whenever I see these, like, instead of this possibly offensive thing, say this other thing, what strikes me immediately about the lists is that the other thing is way more precise, way more specific, right? If you changed all the instances of white to good and all the instances of black to bad, you wouldn't have gained any precision. But when you say, this is the list of who is allowed to send me email and who is denied sending me email, this is the list of applications that will be automatically approved, and this is the list of applications that will be automatically denied, you have gained precision. And that, I think, is a much more fruitful argument. It's a perfectly valid and honest argument. There can be two good reasons for moving away from a particular name. So if somebody pushes back when you tell them you think it's offensive, that's fine, because it's also imprecise. And it may be imprecise because not everybody has your cultural background. Not everyone knows what a Star Trek red shirt is, and not everybody knows the meaning that you're ascribing to this word, when you're using it metaphorically. So I would say stick on that side. There's just more facts available to you on the, but hey, not everybody knows that metaphor side. Adam asks about refactoring to make a type so that you can name better, and then gives the example of print employee report being employee report print. Certainly, if there are 5 or 6 functions in employee that are only related to this report, calculating some numbers that are used on it, that kind of thing, then in the interest of encapsulation, I would refactor out the report into its own class, and then all of the related functions are in that class. I would do it for that reason, for sort of neatness and tidiness. If there was only going to be the one thing in there, which would be print, then I probably wouldn't. Yeah. And Joshua asks, resisting abbreviations versus following business terminology. I think this is a little bit like the exception for the Googling. So you say GPS because that's what we call it. And if there's a business terminology that where they're like, oh, and we got to remember to do the DP3 for that one, then I would probably, have variables that said DP3 in them, for better or for worse. But if the reason, the problem is that there's almost certainly the reason the staff currently call all that a DP3 is because, in like 1402, somebody wrote a program and they were, only allowed a certain number of letters. Like we used to only be allowed 6 letters. And so there was a lot of abbreviating. My Twitter handle, GregCons, is the folder on my personal computer in which we kept stuff related to the business Gregory Consulting, and folder names could only be 8 characters. So we called it GregCons, and then that ended up being our domain and my Twitter handle and everything else. Sometimes those abbreviations leak through and become hallowed, sacred business terminology. Do your part to make that stop happening from here, but you will have to go with it if it has happened in your past. I'm loving the chat, by the way. I want to know how to export the chat. I need these links and all these good things. So light bulb, thanks, Phil. And blue list, that's a good one, Michael. I got to save this. This is a good chat. Thank you all. Let's go back to the top.
So let me ask you this. When does naming happen? As I was prepping the talk, I asked this of a number of people, and they said it depends. But I've come to realize that it doesn't. There are not many different answers. There's only one. You name something when you know what it is. Now, that might be before you even write the code. You're at your desk and you're like, okay, I'm going to need to get all the prices and store them, and then for each item I can look the price up in that thing that I stored it in. And without typing any code, I'm saying nouns, I'm saying verbs. There's going to be price, there's going to be item, there's going to be download or fetch or retrieve or something. There's going to be look up. No code's on the screen, but things are starting to get names. But other times, you've been in the code for a while, and then you suddenly realize what something really is or does, and then it can get its name. Never miss an opportunity to fix a name. You should be working in a tool that lets you do something stronger than search and replace, a genuine refactoring, so that you can give things their names at that moment of realization. Don't just say you'll do it later. If you know something has a bad name, you can say you'll do it later. But when you realize what its name should be, fix it to what it should be right then and there. Often the reason the name is bad, and I've said this before, is because the code's been changing, right? What used to be their name is now their name and phone number, is now their name, phone number, and email, and then you realize its name is really contact info. That's fine. Like, it's not a value judgment that the name is wrong now. The code changed. It's fine. Fix the name. Now, I talked before about not knowing a good name for something when you start and using a really temporary name. And especially when you're refactoring. Like I know this 100 lines is different from the lines after it. I can tell because different variables are, I'd never speak to X again after this point, but I don't know what it is. But it can also happen when you're doing things from scratch. You have to get the real name into the code later. So right now, it may be called update or process or deal with. Do you know how many functions I've met called do it? Yeah, a lot. And they capitalize the I so you don't accidentally pronounce it doit. Stuff. That's okay. But you gotta be able to change it later. Some people believe they can leave something in the code that will enable them to change it later. A to-do comment, for example. I know so much code with to-do comments that says this needs a better name. To-do comments don't work, right? Leaving a crummy name in the code doesn't work, and especially not if you choose something rude or embarrassing. Like, Steve is an idiot. Whether you're Steve or not, that's a terrible thing to leave in the code. You may be counting on somebody at code review or some other gate catching your clearly dumb name and telling you that it's dumb and that you should fix it. But that might not happen. That's a terrible risk. You could end up letting bad stuff out in the wild. And if it does happen, you put work on them for what? Because you didn't want to manage your own tasks. That's not cool. Putting things in the code and hoping that will remind you doesn't work. I've been doing this a long, long time. It doesn't work. Put it somewhere else. Put it in your work tracking system. Make an issue. Open a ticket if you have to. Or have a piece of paper on your desk. But do something else outside of the code to remind you that you need to come back to give it its true name. Now here's the trick, the consultant trick. When something's called process, that's like 5,000 lines long. Nobody knows what it does. You come in and you say, this can't be called process. What does it do? We don't know. No one's known since 1994. Well, it can't be called process. So someone's got to figure out what it is. Well, okay. And they're like, well, I know this part because I work in here sometimes. This makes sure that the inventory is updated. Okay, we'll call that inventory update. And someone else says, oh, I had to change this part a couple years ago. This part's about shipping charges. And it's kind of like stone soup. You end up knowing what the function does and giving it a reasonable name. And now new people will know what it does because it has a reasonable name. And that's a side effect of not letting it be called process, do stuff. Here's another clue. When you can't name something, it's probably because it's the wrong size. Naming a 5,000 line function is impossible because it's a 5,000 line function. Once it calls 10 other things in 20 or 30 lines of code, you can name it. Naming 16 little bits and pieces that together constitute an employee can be much harder than just realizing that they constitute an employee. And now you're just naming member variables of employee, and suddenly that's easy. So a consequence of insisting on names is that people change the size to something they can name. They make things smaller, they make things bigger, and everything ends up with a good name. And it's better code because they made things smaller or bigger. They did some encapsulation, they did some refactoring, whatever. Once you have good code, the code tells a story. I'm going to read all the prices and store them in this structure, and then for each item I'm going to look up the price. Right? It's right there in the story, in the code, the same as it was in the developer's head before it ever turned into C++. So when you insist on good names, you get a story. When you insist on a story, you get good names. Works both ways. Here's what it boils down to. I need you to care about the code you write, the people who are going to read it, the people who are going to run it. I need you to think about the purpose of this function, of this class, of this variable, and who uses them and for what. Don't be paralyzed if you can't give something a name right away, but you must fix it later. If you're committed to names being good, you'll fix it later. You demand good names from yourself in everything you do, including blog posts and tweets and demos and talks. And you ask for them from other people when you're doing a code review, when you're pairing with someone. No, we're not going to call this dummy. Is it really a placeholder, or could you just not think of a name right now? Let's give it a name. If you come to learn what something is and that doesn't match the name, fix the name using a tool that will make that a simple thing to do. If you change what something is, change its name at the same time, and use consistency and storytelling to guide those choices. Because yeah, naming's hard. It is. It's good work, important work, and we can and we will get better at it. Thank you.
That's an interesting question. Alessandro asks whether there's a contrast between telling the story of what the code does and hiding the implementation. And that's because the word does is doing a lot of heavy lifting in that phrase. Yes, I do not want to tell the story of, then we set the fourth bit. Later, we check to see if the third bit is set or not. Thing needs to get copied over into this unit, right? The level of does, the implementation details are not good names. That we mark the order as having shipped, that's telling the story of what the code does. That we, I don't know, set the taxes, calculate the taxes, is telling the story. And there's no crisp line. Like I said at the very beginning, this is not like you turn the handle and good names are going to come out. You need judgment. And you get judgment from experience, and you mostly get experience from bad judgment. So it's a skill that you work at. And when you see good names, you can ask, develop like a meta observer thread and say, wow, I'm really enjoying reading this code. I totally understand it. Why? And look at it, the way you might look at a piece of art and say, what's going on here that's working for me? Is it the symmetry, And is it the liberal use of adjectives that make this code so pleasant? Like, start observing stuff. And when you're lost and floundering and can't figure out what something does, do you have a deeper insight available to you than everything is just called D1, D2, D3? The functions are all called do it. I love seeing people in the chat. Yeah, we have do it. Everyone has do it. It's just a thing. When we don't know what to do, we call it do it. You'll get better at it with practice, but not only the practice of actually naming things, but also the practice of trying to understand the names of things when you read other people's code. So if you care about this as an issue, you'll get better at it over time. And you'll figure out where that border is between explaining what we're doing while hiding all our implementation details. It's a fuzzy border. I know I am over time. I will hang around at a table here in the main room. And if anyone wants to talk more, we can do that. Thanks.